Hello and welcome to another episode of Inside EMA, a podcast about the science behind medicine's regulation and the people who make it possible. Today we're discussing a topic that most people expecting a baby will have experienced, the use of medicines in breastfeeding and pregnancy. So, you're expecting a baby and suddenly something as simple as taking a medicine for a headache or as essential as treating an infection or managing a chronic condition can feel like a complicated decision because the information in the medicine's leaflet may be limited or sometimes just absent. In this episode, we'll explore why this information gap exists and what the European Medicines Agency is doing to ensure women can make informed decisions when using medicines during pregnancy and breastfeeding. To discuss this, I am joined today by Corinne de Vries. Hello, Corinne.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you for having me.
So Corinne leads EMA's strategy on medicines in pregnancy and breastfeeding. She has focused most of her career on this topic, first as a professor of pharmacoepidemiology and then at EMA, which she has joined over 10 years ago. So maybe to start on this topic, can you explain how you got into it? Why did you get interested in this topic of medicines in pregnancy and breastfeeding?
Of course. It goes back all the way to my first year as a pharmacy student back in the 1980s. There I learned about thalidomide, which was a product specifically marketed towards pregnant women as being safe for use in pregnancy, as a product to use if you couldn't sleep or if you were nauseous. And at the time there were only barbiturates, which were harmful and addictive and all that. So this was really marketed as you can use this safely. And even if your child takes an overdose of it, it won't matter. But then their babies were born and they had shorter arms, shorter legs, sometimes no arms or legs, heart defects. It was awful. And that really started the regulatory system we have today to make sure that this can never happen again. But also it really sparked my interest in this topic of what can we do to learn more about the situation, make sure it never happens again, and help use medicine safely if they need to be used in pregnancy or breastfeeding.
Yeah, very interesting. It's true that this example of thalidomide was a bit of a big change, created a big change and leads us maybe to the situation we have today also about medicines in pregnancy, because we know that up to 90% of women who are pregnant or breastfeeding will take medication at some stage. But at the same time, in 71% of medicines, there is just no information about the use of these medicines in this context. So can you tell us a bit more about the situation today? What does it mean for women then?
Of course. So you're absolutely right. So 90% of women use a medicine either because they're using something that's over the counter or because they have a chronic condition, as you mentioned earlier. And with that, medicine use in pregnancy is the norm. It's not the exception, but it's been treated like for decades because of this thalidomide disaster and later deaths. It's been treated as, we must be so cautious, don't use medicines in pregnancy. But actually it's a delusion, and we're kidding ourselves if you think that you're being precautionary by not using a medicine, because sometimes a disease can be more harmful than the treatment. But the reason, so we are here today because people have become so nervous with the thalidomide example. And I think, and I know, we've matured. The system has matured. By now, when a product is allowed on the market, many safety studies in pregnancy have been carried out. And still, we are hesitant to put a lot of the information in the label. So we are working on it. And a lot of the information isn't there yet when the product is on the market. But we're also looking at, what can we do to improve these things?
Because in certain cases, I guess, if women have, for example, a chronic condition that absolutely needs to be treated, then you cannot do without the medicine anyway, and it can be then maybe more harmful for the baby if nothing is done?
That's absolutely right. So there are a few examples, but the short story is, if you have a very sick mother, they will give birth to a very sick, very small baby. And examples are diabetes, epilepsy, lupus, even infections like you mentioned, high fever. All of these diseases, if left untreated, they will cause harm to the baby. And there are products currently on the market which have been researched extensively, for which we know, yes, if you have this disease, you're better off actually using your medicines, taking your medicines really well. Asthma is another important example. Yes. And then, that will be better for the mother and it will be better for the baby.
And I guess in some cases then we have some information that the medicine is safe and can be used. I know that us at EMA, we've come out very strongly a few months ago to say paracetamol is safe in pregnancy. So how can we say that? Why are we so sure about it and that we can say it so strongly?
Yeah, I think we can do a lot more in this space because what you see is, 90% of women use a medicine. So by now, in 2026, we have decades of experience with many medicinal products. And of course, if you know that 200,000 women have used the product during pregnancy and no birth defects, no premature birth, healthy babies have emerged, then, that data exists. It's there to be evaluated. And it is being evaluated time and again. And paracetamol is a perfect example. It's been on the market for so long. It has been accused of a number of adverse pregnancy outcomes, and every time we investigate it, we cannot find the evidence for that. So, and it's such an emotive topic as well, pregnancy. So I think we have to, as society, we have to be very careful with this messaging, because it brings me to an example of the 70s when there was a spray in Christmas trees where there was some scaremongering that this caused birth defects, and people went and had their pregnancies terminated. And of course, the accusation, as it were, was unfounded. So we need to be so careful with not giving false reassurance, but also not scaremongering when there is no scientific ground for it. So I think as a regulatory agency, we have the responsibility to make sure the information is out there and is available, accessible to women and their healthcare professionals. We know the women look for information to the healthcare professionals, but also online and in the newspapers, and they act on it. They act on wherever this information comes from.
So rely on the scientific facts and make sure that we look at the science, and we are guided by it always, of course. So if we look then into solutions, because you're heading this strategy about medicines in pregnancy and breastfeeding. So it means we are in a position where we can act on this, and there are different ways that we can act on this. So I guess this goes from the preclinical stage, so early development of medicines before it goes to human, then the clinical phase, and then once it's on the market, what's in the product information. There's various ways where we can act. Can you tell us a bit more what we're doing at EMA and overall to improve the situation for pregnant and breastfeeding women?
As you say, so what there is currently already a whole program in place to evaluate the benefits and risks of a product before it goes onto the market, and then as it's on the market, we continue evaluating, do the benefits outweigh the risks, and what is the story like for pregnancy and breastfeeding. And so the EMA strategy really looks at, throughout the product lifecycle, where are there opportunities that we're not really using to the full? So there are, before a product is first used in humans, there are animal studies, and there's a whole range of tests on fertility, embryo fetal, and postnatal impact of a medicine on the child and on the mother. Is there anything more we can do? And there are a number of research items that we've identified. Then product developers will come to the agency and ask us for scientific advice on their development. And that's also where we go, can we ask more of these developers? How are you thinking of the development of your product and the evaluation of it in pregnancy? What are you doing in terms of generating data on their impact in pregnancy and in breastfeeding? And then in the post-authorization phase, we've got epidemiological studies, we've got signal detection methods to really elicit any early signals that there might be something wrong, which we've fine-tuned specific for pregnancy, and that's been adopted by the WHO.
So we can be much quicker in understanding if there's a problem. We're not in the situation we were 50 years ago, where it took maybe a number of cases to find out there was an issue. Now it can be effective and quick.
We can be quicker, and there's one example where we've really demonstrated that already again back in the 80s, isotretinoin, a product for acne treatment. We knew before it was allowed on the market that it caused birth defects. And then once it was on the market, some people inadvertently still used it in pregnancy. And indeed, it showed that there are birth defects. But that was discovered within months of it being allowed on the market, as opposed to with thalidomide, where it took years.
Yes.
And now there are stringent pregnancy prevention programs in place for that product and other products where we know it's harmful. So we're also really trying to manage the risks of such products once they're on the market. And then, of course, finally, we're trying to be really consistent throughout the life cycle to generate better information. That needs to make it into the product information. And I think we have a role together with healthcare professionals and others to make sure that we communicate about safety and about risk and about interpreting uncertainty in this quite delicate topic.
So we need to make sure that women have in the leaflet of their medicine at least something that allows them to make a decision based on proper evidence.
Right.
And can I ask you about clinical trials as well? Because this is a topic you've been working a lot on. It's a little bit counterintuitive, right? You think, is it really possible to ask pregnant women to be part of a clinical trial? So how can we act there? What can we do?
Of course, it's part of the life cycle. And that is the part where there is currently a big gap, because the default is exclude pregnant women unless you really cannot avoid it. And the only times when you really cannot avoid it is when you're developing a product that is specifically for use in pregnancy. For example, high blood pressure in pregnancy or gestational diabetes. And that has actually, sometimes that's counterproductive, because there are situations where the standard of care is highly harmful for pregnancy, and there are products being developed that look effective in the early clinical trials, and we're keeping them from pregnant women with this disease that may be incompatible with pregnancy, or where the standard of care is incompatible with pregnancy. So then, is it really right to say exclude unless you really can avoid it? So what we're trying to work towards, and this is something I think we can be very proud of, we've got a global collaboration where from countries all over the world we've now published a draft guideline on how can you responsibly include or consider starting to consider including pregnant women in a clinical trial, or allowing them to continue in the trial if they fall pregnant during that trial and certain conditions are met.
So it's a bit of a switch in mindset,
right?
From excluding to considering where it's possible to include them.
Yeah. It's almost like without thinking, just decide, oh, we're not going to include pregnant women, of course. Just think, well, actually, for this product, might it make sense to include? So instead of exclude unless, go to, well, actually, maybe we should include. And then if that's the case, then certain studies on the potential impact in pregnancy and breastfeeding need to be done earlier.
Okay. And what about breastfeeding then? Because I guess the situation is very different than pregnancy, because the baby is out. So you can maybe have more opportunities there. But I don't feel like there's much happening for the moment. So what is your perspective on this? What can be done?
Yeah, I was going exactly to the breastfeeding topic. Because, of course, as you say, so if you're pregnant and you're taking a medicine, there is no option. There is no choice. You're taking the medicine, your baby might be exposed to this medicine. With breastfeeding, there is a choice. You can choose not to breastfeed. And that is currently happening a lot, that people are deciding, I'm not going to breastfeed because I do not know whether this product is going to make it into the milk and hence into my baby. But the result of that is that we know that some breastfeeding is actually avoided unnecessarily in a situation where the mother would actually ideally prefer to breastfeed, and we know there are benefits to the baby of breastfeeding. So what can you do? And what you can do is you can study the transfer of of a medicine into the breast milk before you give this breast milk to the baby. So that could be step one in a clinical trial. If somebody is, for example, has stopped breastfeeding their baby, is starting a medicine, they could say, well, actually, I'll take this medicine, I will express for 1 week longer, and I'll give this milk available for research so that women after me who would like to breastfeed their baby and who need to use this product have this information. And we know that women are willing to do this. And we also know you only need 12 women to be able to be willing to do this, to get that information. And then the next step is, okay, so if I know there's hardly any of this product gets into the milk, can I give this to the baby? And then can we monitor how much of the product gets into the baby, and how bad is that? And all you need is a heel prick from a baby. It's not super invasive. And again, people are willing to do it. And I believe it is so important because at the moment, the labeling information on breastfeeding is even less rich than the information on the medicine use in pregnancy.
Well, it seems somehow less complex to make it happen, as if I hear you correctly. So that's unfortunate, and I hope it can change indeed. Yeah. Thank you very much. To finish on this podcast, we usually ask our guests for a recommendation about something they've read, something they've seen, a series, a film, whatever, linked to the topic that maybe will make people think a little bit more and help them understand the topic a bit more. Do you have one for us, please?
Yes, as you know, I've been struggling to choose because there are so many. But I've come down to this book written by Emma Donoghue, an Irish author, who also wrote the book Room. But this book that I'm talking about is called The Pull for the Stars. And it's set in the 1918 influenza pandemic, Spanish influenza. And I won't tell you the story, but it reads like a thriller. And it is set in Dublin in a maternity ward, which for the purposes of this pandemic is now called the fever maternity ward. It plays over 3 days. And my takeaways from this book are, high fever in medicine is dangerous. You know, again, very ill mothers will give very ill babies. So high fever gives rise to premature births. Infant mortality is high in this book, in this setting. And we have moved on from that. And we have also, medicine has evolved a lot after that. But one of the lessons from this story as well is, here we're talking about a neglected population. There's a lot of poverty. It's a part of society not looked after very well by the Irish government. That's one of the messages. And, you know, you learn from this book, we need to start looking after the more neglected populations. And I'm optimistic that that's now what we're doing for pregnant populations and breastfeeding populations. So I recommend the book. And
thank you. Yes, yeah. It's another insight into how things were maybe a long time ago, and that maybe we're moving away also from this, at least in terms of women in pregnancy and breastfeeding and their use of medicine. So thank you for that. Well, thank you very much for sharing all these insights and for sharing your experience and your knowledge on the topic, Corinne. That was a very interesting discussion.
I'm grateful for the opportunity. It's great you're doing these series.
Yes, and I guess it's always good to be able to talk about these topics as well, because, I mean, this is something that so many, I mean, even myself, so many people have experienced, you know, being in front of this leaflet in the medicine and thinking, what am I doing with this now? So This is a really important discussion, so I'm glad we could have it today. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you very much for tuning into this episode. If you have appreciated it, please like, share it with a friend, subscribe to it, and you can also check out our other episodes online. And we hope to see you next time. Goodbye.